What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 11. Final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for this week's NFL slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL Week 11, let's take a look at the quarterback position. So I like Justin Fields from the Chicago Bears playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Justin Fields has averaged 21.9 fantasy points per game on the season, and I like this pick because he's getting an average of 10.4 rush attempts per game. He's rushing the ball just as much, if not more recently, than Jalen Hurts. Take a look at his rush attempts real quick. Justin Fields has rushed the ball 13, 15, and 8 times in the last 3 games. So that gives him monster fantasy point upside. He's going to be about 14% owned, projected at 21.1 fantasy points here in Week 11. He's 7,600 DraftKings salary, 1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Chicago Bears trailing by 3. So Justin Fields has scored 43, 46, and 26 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He's been on fire. Now it's a good matchup, a good game script here. High scoring game, close competitive game. So I like Justin Fields here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Okay, another quarterback that I like is Dak Prescott from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 9th worst defense overall. They give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Dak Prescott has averaged 16.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.5 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 8% owned, projected at 18.7 fantasy points here in Week 11. He's 6,600 DraftKings salary, 900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points scored in this game, with the Cowboys favored by 1.5. Dak Prescott, he's been heating up. He scored 21, 26, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 4, 5, and 3 rush attempts in those games. So I like Dak Prescott here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, now if you're looking to save some salary at the quarterback position, take a look at Daniel Jones from the New York Giants playing the Detroit Lions, who have the absolute worst defense overall, giving up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So the matchup can't get any better here. And Daniel Jones has scored an average of 17.1 fantasy points per game, getting an average of 7.7 rush attempts per game. So he's got that rushing upside as well. And he's going to be about 7% owned, projected at 18.5 fantasy points here in Week 11. And he's coming in at only 5,700 DraftKings salary. He is 2,100 more on FanDuel. So I love that DraftKings price. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 45 points scored in this game, with the Giants favored by 3. Daniel Jones has scored 18, 9, and 32 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 5, 6, and 11 rush attempts in those games. So I like Daniel Jones here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So the stud on the slate that I like is Saquon Barkley. He's got a fantastic matchup here versus the Lions, who have the worst defense overall, giving up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So Saquon Barkley got 35 rush attempts last week. That's not a sustainable number. Probably come down to earth somewhere around 20 to 25 touches here this week. But it is a great matchup, so I like Saquon Barkley as my favorite stud pick. Now, if you're looking to save some salary, there's 3 picks here that I like that are around the 6K range. So you have Ramondre Stevenson from the New England Patriots playing the New York Jets, who have a good defense overall. They've been good versus opposing running backs, but Ramondre Stevenson has averaged 16.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.3 rush attempts per game and 4.8 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 18% owned, projected at 15.9 fantasy points here in week 11. He's 6,700 DraftKings salary, 1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 38 points scored in this game, with the Patriots favored by 3.5. So Ramondre Stevenson has scored 16, 21, and 24 fantasy points in the last 3 games, and he got 15, 16, and 11 rush attempts. But what I like about this pick is he also got 7, 8, and 8 pass targets, so he's quite involved in the passing game, which gives that fantasy point upside you like to see in your running backs, especially in the point per reception leagues like DraftKings. So I like Ramondre Stevenson here versus the New York Jets. Okay guys, it's time to announce the winner of our $25 weekly PayPal giveaway, and the winner is Sean Johnson, or Chawan Johnson. Congratulations, you are the winner of this week's $25 PayPal giveaway. Please reply to our comment to collect your prize.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Coming down in salary a little bit, I like Damon Pierce from the Houston Texans playing the Washington Commanders, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing running backs. Damon Pierce has averaged 15.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 18.3 rush attempts per game and 3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 17% owned, projected at 15.2 fantasy points here in week 11. He's 6,500 DraftKings salary, 1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 40.5 points scored in this game, with the Houston Texans trailing by 3. Damon Pierce has scored 13, 17, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 17, 27, and 15 rush attempts, on top of 3, 0, and 5 pass targets. So pretty good volume here, decent production, and the price tag is fairly good as well. So I like Damon Pierce here versus the Washington Commanders. Now coming down in salary even more here, although he has not played well recently, I think he's in a good spot, and I think he's due for a breakout game. So I like David Montgomery from the Chicago Bears playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 2nd worst defense overall. They give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. David Montgomery has averaged 9.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 12.8 rush attempts per game, 1.9 pass targets per game, going to be about 18% owned, projected at 13.1 fantasy points here in week 11. He's 6,100 DraftKings salary and only 100 more on FanDuel, so I love that FanDuel price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Bears trailing by 3. So I think what makes this play attractive here is the matchup. Somewhat high-scoring game here, close, competitive game. And David Montgomery only got 10 touches last week, but he does average around 15 touches. So I think he will get his season average or more. I think he's going to be a good value play, especially on FanDuel. So I like David Montgomery here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So the stud that I like, you got Justin Jefferson. He's super expensive at $9,100 DraftKings salary. Same price on FanDuel, and he does have a good matchup here versus the Cowboys. So, of course, I like Justin Jefferson as a stud pick. But the stud that I like this week is CeeDee Lamb from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 9th worst defense overall. They give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And CeeDee Lamb has averaged 17.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.8 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 92% of the snaps, going to be about 22% owned, projected at 18.4 fantasy points here in Week 11. He's $7,500 DraftKings salary, $600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points scored in this game, with the Cowboys favored by 1.5. Now, CeeDee Lamb has scored 41, 19, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 15, 7, and 6 pass targets, and he gets an occasional rush attempt as well. He's rushed the ball 2 times in the last 3 games. So good matchup here, somewhat high-scoring game, close, competitive game, coming off of a monster week last week. I hope it's not a letdown game. I don't think it will be. So I like CeeDee Lamb here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Another wide receiver I like is T. Higgins from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. T. Higgins has averaged 13.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.4 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 16% owned, projected at 16.3 fantasy points here in Week 11. He's $7,100 DraftKings salary, $500 more on FanDuel, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 40.5 points scored in this game, with the Bengals favored by 4. Now, just remember the last time that the Bengals played, Joe Mixon had like 5 touchdowns. He just absolutely went off. So I have a feeling the Pittsburgh Steelers are not going to let Joe Mixon beat them here this week. So that's going to put pressure on the passing game. Means there's probably going to be a lot of passes to be had in this game to some open wide receivers. So T. Higgins has scored 13, 14, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 8, 6, and 7 pass targets. So I like T. Higgins here versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I also think that you could run a stack here with Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, and Tyler Boyd. And then if Joe Mixon has a letdown game after that monster game last week, could be interesting for these wide receivers from the Cincinnati Bengals. So I like that stack. But now, one of my favorite wide receiver plays this week, and this is due to injury here, I'll go over the injuries in a second, is Courtland Sutton from the Denver Broncos playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the 2nd worst defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing wide receivers. Courtland Sutton has averaged 11.5 fantasy points per game on the season, Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups. Getting an average of 8.1 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 93% of the snaps, gonna be about 15% owned, projected at 13.5 fantasy points here in week 11. He's 6,000 DraftKings salary, 1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41.5 points scored in this game, with the Broncos favored by 3. Courtland Sutton has scored 13, 2, and 5 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 11, 4, and 9 pass targets. But what I like about this pick here, let's take a look at Courtland Sutton and the injuries at the wide receiver position for the Denver Broncos are mounting up here. Jerry Jeudy is out. That's the main injury that's going to open up extra pass targets for Courtland Sutton. He could get 15 plus pass targets here this week. KJ Hamler is out. Kendall Hinton is questionable. So Courtland Sutton, we're going to be one of the only capable wide receivers to get the ball this week. He should get monster volume. So I like Courtland Sutton here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Now I also like DJ Moore, Brandon Cooks, Darnell Mooney, and I think Darius Slayton is an interesting sleeper pick as well. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. I just went over all the wide receiver injuries for the Denver Broncos. So Courtland Sutton, of course, he's not going to get all the extra pass targets. The other capable pass catcher they have is Greg Dulcich from the Denver Broncos, playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the second worst defense overall. They give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Greg Dulcich has averaged 9.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.3 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 100% of the snaps, so he's always out there, and he's going to be about 10% owned, projected at 9.5 fantasy points here in week 11. Only 3,800 DraftKings salary, 1,700 more on FanDuel. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 41.5 points scored in this game, with the Broncos favored by 3. Greg Dulcich has scored 2, 13, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 4, 5, and 9 pass targets. So fantastic matchup here. He should get some extra pass targets this week with all those injuries at the wide receiver position. Salary is low, so I like Greg Dulcich here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. I also like Dalton Schultz from the Dallas Cowboys, playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 9th worst defense overall. They give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Dalton Schultz has averaged 8.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.3 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 74% of the snaps, going to be about 10% owned, projected at 10.5 fantasy points here in week 11. He's 4,300 DraftKings salary, 1,600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points scored in this game, with the Cowboys favored by 1.5. Dalton Schultz has scored 17, 13, and 10 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 8, 7, and 5 pass targets. So I like Dalton Schultz here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Now I also like TJ Hawkinson, Cole Kmet, and I think Hayden Hurst could be an interesting pick as well. if you want to add to your stack, or if you want to do like a Joe Burrows, Tyler Boyd, and Hayden Hurst, that stack to kind of play against the Joe Mixon letdown game, or play for the Joe Mixon letdown game. If you want to stack some pass catchers from the Bengals, I think Hayden Hurst is in a good spot just because his salary is so low. He's averaging 8.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.3 pass targets per game. Only going to be about 6% owned, projected at 9.3 fantasy points here in week 11. Only $3,500 DraftKings salary, $1,700 more on FanDuel. So I like Hayden Hurst. I also like Kyle Pitts from the Atlanta Falcons playing the Chicago Bears. Although the Bears have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall and have been pretty good versus opposing tight ends, Kyle Pitts, he's averaged 7.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 9% owned, projected at 10 fantasy points here in week 11. He's $4,400 DraftKings salary, $1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Falcons favored by 3. Now, Kyle Pitts hasn't played that well the last couple of weeks, but he had a pretty good game before that, and this guy's got 20-plus fantasy point upside, just hasn't shown it too much throughout this season, so I do think he's due for another big game. So he scored 5, 5, and 19 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 8, 7, and 9 pass targets. So the volume is there. He just needs to find the end zone. So I like Kyle Pitts here versus the Chicago Bears.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video, or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.